we all need heroes in our lives. And Marc Freedman is a hero of mine. He is my modern elder. Yes, he's a couple years older than me. But when I first started looking into the longevity and aging space, everybody I talked to who was sort of peripherally or involved in the space kept telling me, go talk to Marc. Marc seems to know the most about this. And Marc was so generous with his time. We were supposed to spend, I think, an hour for a lunch, and we went much longer than that. And he was so helpful for me in my early, very curious stage of thinking about life stages. He's written many very good books. I think all of them are in the MEA library. His most recent one is a spectacular book called How to Live Forever, The Enduring Power of Connecting the Generations. And his talk today will be very much focused on that. His colleague, senior colleague, Marcy Albaher, is one of our guest faculty members and did a workshop. Woo, yes, did a workshop in late January, and she was on the Mastery Hour with Jeff and Carrie Hannon recently. So I'm going to just pass it on to Marc and just say, Marc, thank you so much for being part of the MEA community, for giving us your time. You are exceptionally popular on the lecture circuit. So for us to get a little bit of your time today is much appreciated. And so for everybody who's wondering, will we have Q&A with Marc? We in fact will. So Marc, take it away.
Thanks so much, Chip. It's embarrassing almost, but I'm such an unabashed fan of Chip's and of the MEA. I'm just one step away from wandering the streets of San Francisco with an MEA sandwich board, accosting strangers and sending them to Baja. So that's when Chip said it would be possible to be part of the Resumi, and I was absolutely overjoyed. And it's also such an honor to follow Jeff and to hear Carrie and Stephen's presentation. The invocation of Joseph Campbell made me think of my favorite Joseph Campbell line, so appropriate to MEA, which is, midlife is when you get to the top of the ladder and discover it's leaning against the wrong wall. And we all need a place to go and find that new wall, and MEA is definitely that place. I thought I'd start and just invoke my own modern elder, in part because one of the real highlights of last year for me was the chance to be on a panel with Chip at the 60th reunion of his father's class at Stanford. And I discovered that day that their commencement speaker had been John Gardner, who 40 years later became my mentor and taught me what it meant to be a modern elder. And I've been thinking about John a lot lately because he was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare and was the architect of the Great Society. And during the battles over Medicare, he said, America today faces breathtaking opportunities disguised as unsolvable problems. And I can think of no better characterization of the situation today. But then at one time I remember having coffee with him, and he told me something which I feel like could be a watchword for every modern elder. He said that he didn't really find his purpose in life until he discovered that it was much more important to be interested than to be interesting. And that has rattled around for me for a long time. John won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964, which is, the ultimate gold watch, and then went on to do most of his the most important work in his life after he got his ostensible gold watch. And it was an amazing group of people who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. This year that award came up because Rush Limbaugh received it from our current president. Well, in 1964, along with John Gardner, some of the winners were Helen Keller, John Steinbeck, T.S. Eliot, Walt Disney, Aaron Copland, Reinhold Niebuhr, Edward R. Murrow. It was a bumper class. But one of the other people who's not nearly as well known who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom that year is a person that I wanted to start out by talking about today, because I think he has a lot to say about the importance of being a modern elder. And I would hope you'll indulge me for the first 10 minutes or so. I want to talk about some historical context, which I think helps to put some of the challenges we're facing today in a clearer light, and the significance of what it means to be a modern elder. And that other person who I want to talk about is a guy by the name of Lewis Mumford, who was the New Yorker's architectural critic for 30 years, and along with Jane Jacobs, one of the great visionaries of urban life in America over the past century. 8 years before he got that award in 1964, he wrote the cover article for Architectural Record. And Mumford was the person who discovered Frank Lloyd Wright and the Chicago School of Architecture, but he wrote that article not about architecture, but about what it meant to be an elder in society and about aging. He had just turned 61 himself. Little did he know he would live to 100 and have almost 4 decades in front of him. But that day he was in a despairing mood when he wrote that article. He said at no point in any society had older people been more rejected than in America today. And this came a few years after Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, described retirees as too old to work, too young to die. And he said, you know, it's great, we've added all these years to life. Problem is we put them at the wrong end of life. And Mumford was a man of action and of strong opinions, and he wasn't there to despair. He was there to lay out his prescriptions for how we could fix this problem. And he had 2 in particular. The first thing he had to say is that whatever we do, we have to avoid infantilizing older people and turning later life into a kind of second childhood. But his primary message was expressed in the title of his article, which is that we had to do everything possible to keep older people from being pushed to the outskirts of society. The article was entitled "For Older People, Not Segregation, Integration." And that same year, 1956, a guy by the name of Big Ben Schleifer put the finishing touches on the first retirement community in America, built centrally around the 2 things, doing exactly the opposite of everything that Mumford said. That community was around creating a place where older people could be kids again, have a second childhood. Its name was Youngtown, and its core principle was radical age segregation, in part because Big Ben Schleifer wanted to create a community that was affordable for older people living on Social Security. But he also discovered that preserving the illusion of a second childhood was helped greatly by the absence of any real children. If everybody was old, then nobody was old. And he was no less idealistic than Lewis Mumford was. He was a socialist. He was trying to create a kibbutz on the outskirts of Phoenix for older people, except he believed that there was no hope in mainstream society, that the only place where older people could find dignity and joy and community was apart from everybody else in America of 1956. And so these 2 visions were articulated almost the same time, and I don't have to tell you which one carried the day. Youngtown was featured that same year on Dave Garroway's Wide Wide World TV show, the Today Show of the time, watched by millions of people, captured the American imagination. One of the people who watched that show was Del Webb, who built across the street from the 100 homes of Youngtown the first Sun City, where 60,000 people live. And when he opened Sun City on January 1st, 1960, 100,000 people showed up. There was a traffic jam for 22 miles to get there. Older people all over America dropped whatever they were doing and went to the godforsaken cotton field 20 miles outside of Phoenix to live what Webb coined the golden years. And so it was a big change. We were at this crossroads. We picked one particular route, and in truth, and this is my last indulgence in history, it was a turning point in a century-long transformation of American society. So the United States began the 20th century as one of the most age-integrated societies in the world and ended it as the most age-segregated. In fact, Andrew Scott, the author of The 100-Year Life, another wonderful book, professor at London Business School, describes it as a state of age apartheid. In 19th century America, all the generations were woven together. People lived in multi-generational houses. They worked side by side, young people, older people, in an agrarian economy. Even the one-room schoolhouse had 5-year-olds and 40-year-olds learning to read side by side. People had no idea how old they were. If you were to ask somebody in 19th century America their age, it would be like asking your colleagues from MEA what their blood type is. You'd never even think to do it. It seemed totally irrelevant. And then as we moved into the 20th century, we decided to reorganize society around efficiency. And it was the result in many cases of progressive reform. So child labor laws and universal schooling led to young people being in schools with other young people. Great breakthroughs like Social Security had as an explicit purpose getting older people out of the workforce at a time when we had 20% unemployment among young people. Then we created senior centers and retirement communities and one institution after another that was for older people exclusively, and the generational twains stopped meeting. Young people were in schools, middle people were at work, and older people were off to the sidelines. And there were positive results of that. But when we look back from the current perspective, I think we've created a society that runs against the grain of much of what we've learned about human thriving. And it turns out that Youngtown, that great idealistic kibbutz in the middle of the desert that Big Ben Schleifer created, ended up becoming the embodiment of this grievous wound that we've inflicted on ourselves. In the late 90s, they were in the national press again, but it wasn't a fawning portrait on daytime TV. They were in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. Why were they in the news? Because they were ejecting a pair of grandparents, their crime harboring their grandson, Chaz Cope, who was running from an abusive father elsewhere in Arizona. The only place he had to turn were his grandparents. Did the Youngtown community rally around them and bring them lasagnas and ask how they could help out? Instead, they started fining them $100 a day for harboring children and planted a sign on their lawn. It's like the scarlet letter that said harboring children. The New York Times pointed out that dogs were allowed at Youngtown, not children. And across the street at Del Webb's massive Sun City community, the most popular volunteer activity at that point and to this day are the age police, which are our volunteer retirees, many of them former law enforcement personnel who follow school buses around in the area to make sure they're not dropping children off at Sun City. So is it any surprise in that context, in a state of age apartheid, that we're hearing about conflict between the generations, okay boomer, okay millennial? Is it any surprise that ageism has become so rampant, or that loneliness is considered the single greatest public health epidemic in America today, maybe after COVID now? The equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and the two loneliest groups in society are older people and younger ones. Again, a society that runs against the grain of human thriving. And now, as we become a more old than young society, 2019 was the first year in American history we had more people over 60 than under 18. We really got to fix this. This has got to change. And my central message today is an optimistic one, that we can fix this, we can change it, that Lewis Mumford was right and he was realistic at the same time. And this is where I was just so happy to listen to Carrie and Stephen talking about love, because I feel like the work that I'm involved in, and even my message today, is really a message of essentially of love that flows up and down the generational chain. And it's a kind of interdependence and need that goes to the beginning of human history. A lot of evolutionary anthropologists today feel that the only reason we became human beings in the first place is because grandmothers played this critical role taking care of young children while both parents in hunter-gatherer societies were able to go out and hunt and gather, and that enabled the long helpless period that allows human babies to grow large brains and be human beings. So this is not a new idea, but what we have learned over the last half century is that the needs and the assets of younger and older people fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. I spent the first 15 years of my career working to come up with new ideas for schools and social programs to help young people. And the main thing that I learned is that love matters most when it comes to the development, the healthy development of kids. And Yuri Bronfenbrenner, one of the great child psychologists of the 20th century, the co-founder of the Head Start program, was a professor at Cornell for 40 years. At the end of his life, after having written 24 books and 1,000 articles, was asked what he had learned from all of this research. And he said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And what I've learned since then, and I say this as a 62-year-old, is that those of us in the second half of life need to be irrationally crazy about young people. Again, the jigsaw puzzle that fits together. So Laura Carstensen, a friend of Chip's and mine and a former Encore board member, has spent years doing research developing a theory called socio-emotional selectivity, which sounds very complicated and obscure with lots of formulas. In fact, it's the simplest idea in the world. What she's shown is that human beings have an inchoate capacity to know how much time is left in life. And when we get to this point where we realize that there are fewer days ahead than behind in some kind of rough way, it has an impact. You know, if somebody tells you you have a month left to live, you don't think, wow, this would be a terrific time to learn German, or boy, I always wanted to take up the oboe. No, you go see the people that you love. You focus on relationship. And she showed this over and over again in studies, even with young people who, you know, are given this idea of fewer days ahead. It drives us towards relationship. And what Laura and other developmental psychologists focused on adulthood have shown is that there's some other good news, which is that as we get older, we not only focus on relationships, but we get really good at them. I keep telling myself that every time I'm, you know, being mean to my children or to my wife, but emotional regulation, empathy blossom in later life, and they turn out to be the absolute key to happiness. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, the gold standard of research on well-being in adulthood, has discovered that happiness is based on relationship. George Vaillant, the psychiatrist who ran it for 40 years, says happiness is love, full stop. And he goes further and shows that there's a direction to all this connection, and it's downward. He's shown that older people who mentor and support young people, who essentially embody the modern elder ethos, are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. You know, I'm used to looking at social science studies, which people are 12% happy or, you know, 21% happy. And that's, you know, major national news. 3 times as likely to be happy. And he says it's not an accident. It kind of goes back to the grandmother hypothesis. He says it's baked into human development and evolution. And he has a beautiful phrase, biology flows downhill. And, you know, to go back to some of those earlier comments and to Youngtown and age apartheid, if biology flows downhill, why have we been trying to swim upstream? Why have we made that so difficult in modern American life and through much of the world? We essentially rerouted the river of life, and we need to return it to its natural course. And the good news I'm here to impart is not only does that fit with human development and human evolution, but we're already seeing a movement of people who I guess are in the realm of human resilience, who are returning that river of life to its natural course. And it reminds me, to switch metaphors, David Brooks wrote a book, The Second Mountain, last year, and in it he tells a story that has really stuck with me, and it's about a guy in Southern California who buys a house and who hates bamboo, and it has a bamboo grove at this house. And so the first thing he does after signing his papers to own the house is to go to Ace Hardware and buy a bunch of tools and come back and chop down the bamboo grove. And in the process, he pours bag after bag of bamboo poison plant killer on top of it. And then he brings in a contractor to lay down a sidewalk over the bamboo grove, and it's like on the 7th day he rests. And a year later, the bamboo is breaking through the sidewalk. And, there's something about human nature that is driving us to reconnect across generations, despite all of these years of trying to make that harder and harder. And I spent 2 years traveling around the world looking at examples of it, and came away extraordinarily inspired and animated and hopeful. I went to Singapore, where they've spent 3 billion Singaporean dollars, 2.1 billion American dollars, for a city of 4 million people, to create, in their words, a kampong for all ages, kampong being the Malay word for village, built around the ideal of intergenerational harmony. And they've done it, despite these lofty sounding goals, in ruthlessly pragmatic ways. No surprise for Singapore. Every new senior center in Singapore that's built is co-located with a preschool. Every new housing complex that's built is built around the idea of 3-gen flats. They've created a volunteer corps of 100,000 elders who are focusing on schools and helping the next generation thrive. Every playground that's built is designed in a way that's built around the intergenerational accessibility. And the complete opposite end, I went to the UK, where Lucy Kellaway, this wonderful journalist at the Financial Times, daughter did the British equivalent of Teach for America, Teach First, and was so inspired by that. She flipped the whole old adage of, following in your parents' footsteps. She followed in her daughter's footsteps, wrote a column 3 years ago in the Financial Times at the age of 58 saying, that's it. A year from now, I'm not going to be writing these columns anymore, even though I have the best job in the world. I'm going to be teaching math in front of a low-income London classroom. And then she went and did something that nobody else has, of that stature, has ended up doing here in the United States. She challenged her readers of a certain age to quit their jobs and to follow her. She was kind of a Pied Piper. 1,000 people signed up for Now Teach, the program that she created. They had 20 slots. They had 50 people applying for every slot. They eventually got it up to 40. In Finland, there's this massive effort to create community grandparents, because even in Finland, grandparents and grandchildren aren't living in the same place frequently. And so to try to create bonds between older and younger people who aren't related by blood. And here in the United States, I'll just tell you 2 stories that have really inspired me. So one, I went to Cleveland in November a couple of years ago to a fancy 1920s hotel that had been turned into an assisted living community called Judson Manor. And when I showed up, there were 40 Swedish social scientists in the lobby. And, you got to ask the question, why are the Swedish social scientists coming to the Rust Belt in November to figure out ideas about how we can live better? That's, usually we're going to Stockholm to do that. And they were at Judson Manor because they were in the middle of an experiment where the culturally literate, music-loving residents of Judson Manor, which is poised between the Cleveland Clinic on one side, Case Western University, all the major arts institutions of Cleveland on the other side, had decided to create a program where they were providing free living for graduate students in music in return for these students playing concerts. And it was kind of, an efficient exchange. These young people got free housing, these older people, music-loving older people got free concerts. Well, it turns out what starts out with efficiency in this realm oftentimes ends up in humanity. I'll just tell you one story. When I went there, I met this 93-year-old woman, Carla, who told me about the young violist who had lived next door to her during that year, who married another young violist who was a grad student at the conservatory. And when they planned their wedding, they didn't invite Carla to the wedding. They asked her to be the maid of honor. And it made me realize that the key in so much of this is a combination of proximity and purpose, of being able to be near each other and having common interests. And I think that's so essential. And it brings me to my other story before I kind of round the corner and try to take this home, which is my favorite new group, which is Nuns and Nuns. So it's N-U-N-S and N-O-N-E-S. So, you know, when these survey companies like Pew Research do studies of millennials, they oftentimes conclude that millennials are N-O-N-E-S's. They're spiritually inclined, but religiously unaffiliated. And a group of these NONESs starting at Harvard Divinity School decided that, you know, they want to live a life of purpose, of dedication to a cause greater than themselves, fighting poverty, creating a more equitable world. And they needed modern elders to do that. And so who did they reach out to? But in 17 communities around the country, they started meetups with NUNSs, older women who dedicated their lives to creating a better world, oftentimes taking a vow of poverty to do that. And when I first met them, they were in residence together at the Mercy Center in Burlingame, trying to figure out how they could work to create a better world. And it was so interesting, the NUNSs, orders were shrinking, in many cases dying out, but they were much more interested in their work living on through the next generation, not necessarily through the form that they chose. And so before the virus hit, they were had deployed to the border to work on refugee issues, and were planning a major voter registration turnout campaign in Wisconsin for the election. So there's, you know, the bamboo is breaking through the sidewalk. People are fixing this. And I think if you take a step back and look at the lessons from these, they're lessons that the Modern Elder Academy and the Modern Elder Ideal embody so beautifully. I mean, the first is a new ethos. Rather than trying so hard to be young, to be there for those who actually are. And also a dedication to creating the kinds of institutions and opportunities that can serve us in this new century, to be as creative in bringing people together across age as we've been in splitting them apart. And I think the big unanswered question, I mean, there are people living out that ethos. There are wonderful examples of new arrangements that are making it more possible, but we've got a lot more Big Ben Schleifers than we do Del Webbs. We really need to find ways to scale these ideas that are commensurate with the need, with the opportunity. I'm convinced we can do it. We can fix this. We have to fix it in a more old than young demographic context, but I'm also convinced that it can fix us. It can reconnect us to a fundamental part of the human experience that we've been in danger of squandering. There's a lot of efficiency in this, and in fact, I always feel like I want to invoke another one of my heroes, Maggie Kuhn, who founded the Grey Panthers, and who's buried in my native Philadelphia under a gravestone that says, "Here lies Maggie Kuhn under the only stone she left unturned." She said something that is very appropriate to the COVID moment, where we're telling people of a certain age to stay home, to stay safe, but really also to stay the hell out of the way. And Maggie said, we don't have a single person to waste. And that is true. But I think even beyond the efficiency in her statement is the humanity that I saw at Judson Manor. Older and younger people need each other. Was true at the beginning of human history. It's as true as ever today. It was something that Lewis Mumford understood. He said at one point that every generation revolts against its parents and falls in love with its grandparents. But the Greeks knew that too. They had a beautiful expression: society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit. And it seems to me the perfect watchword for a modern elder in the times of old in the present day, and no better benediction or prescription for how we can make the most of the multi-generational society that's already washing over us. So with that, I'll stop and apologize again for the one long unpunctuated sentence, but I also express my gratitude to Chip and MEA and the chance to be with you today.
The pandemic is increasingly separating the older generation for fear of exposure. I feel this is a trend that will still worsen. The relationship with my kids and my parents have been quintessential and amazing, and now they cannot interact. We are not alone. How can we mend the ever-growing divide to accomplish the goals you envision that are so wonderful?
That's very much on my mind as well, and I feel almost at every turn in those remarks, I needed to take a sidestep and talk about the pandemic. Chip wrote a column recently in which he talked about the mother of invention. I think I've got it over here somewhere, and I feel like my hope is that the pandemic can be the grandmother of invention and can prompt us to come up with new and better vehicles to connect people, not during this time of physical distancing and beyond. And one of my favorite examples is one that Chip just wrote about, Eldera, that's being launched by 3 entrepreneurs, including Dana Griffin, I think, who's one of Chip's mentees, and they're directly addressing the need of so many young people today to have additional educational support. People are talking about the COVID slide, the learning losses that young people are facing. I mean, just the state of young people. 5 years ago, Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist who wrote Bowling Alone, wrote a book called Our Kids, and said that the state of children in America today was so bad that it was going to destroy the American dream for a century. And then the pandemic hit. And so this is an all hands on deck moment when it comes to kids. And these kids, within families need their grandparents, beyond families into communities, need modern elders in their lives. And we have really got to get creative and brilliant and entrepreneurial to find new ways to connect generations for mutual benefit. There are some terrific things that are going on now. One of my favorite, but they're mostly focused within families, is Caribou, that was started out of Miami, but has been growing rapidly. And it's a platform that enables grandparents and grandchildren to connect and provides learning materials. There was a recent New York Times op-ed about the need for a grandparent academy. One of the Times opinion writers talked about the role his parents were playing in educating their children. But I think it needs to go beyond the period of physical distancing. And my dream, so I'll just say this for a few minutes, but JFK gave the most remarkable speech on aging that's ever been given in American history 6 months before he was assassinated in 1963. He got up in front of Congress and said, we'd add years to life. Now it was time to add life to those years. And since that point, we've added 2 months a year on average to the American lifespan. And we basically whiffed when it comes to adding life to those years. And he set out this vision of a national mobilization of older people focused on creating a better future. and it was, you know, a few years after his Ask Not speech to the young boomers, and it was almost like he was speaking to their future selves and providing this vision of a mobilization of older people to transform society. And he said we were wasting resources of incalculable value. Right? This is a 40-something president writing 1963. Have you heard anything like that from any president, Democrat or Republican, since, or any of the 70-something presidential candidates? So I think we need a call to action, and I think we need a call to innovation as well to make that action not only possible, but to have the greatest impact.
Wow, Mark, you're amazing. I mean, I think we would have questions all day long. I would like to call on two people. Luther has a great question for you, and then we'll have Chip go after Luther, or we would be here for the rest of the weekend for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Mark. This is Luther. Great talk. I really loved it. What I was just wondering is, you mentioned so many different projects and things out there. I mean, what would you pick if you said, okay, what are the best multi-generational projects around the world that you think should be and can be done in the United States today? What would one or two of those be?
That's a great question. You know, I have a lot of, I've been thinking a lot about housing lately, because housing played such an enormous role in separating the generations out. And, you know, I mean, this is, I guess, a hopeful comment. You know, we created this state of age apartheid in 50 years, really. And if we could, and it was created by brilliant entrepreneurs, particularly housing entrepreneurs. And they did it so effectively that it seemed like it was the oxygen in the air, you know, that things had always been like this, when in fact, for thousands and thousands of years, they'd been anything like that. And so I've been paying particular attention to a group of housing entrepreneurs. I just spoke yesterday with this woman, Noelle Marcus, who is in her late 20s, had graduated from the MIT City Planning Program a few years ago, and her senior project was a home sharing effort between older people and young people that has taken Boston by storm and is now expanding to Columbus and to Seattle. And the basic idea is that older people who have room to spare can have roommates. They start out with graduate students being in Boston, where there's so much higher education, who pay reduced rent, do some chores. But again, it's what starts in efficiency, ends in humanity. And Brenda Atchison, one of the older women living in Roxbury in Boston, was telling me about her experience having this young person living in her house. And I asked her, you know, was there a moment that she could think of that really captured it? And she described coming home on a winter night and walking down the street towards her house, and the lights were on. And it reminded her as a child of what it was like to come home and have the lights on. So I think that there's a lot of creativity in the housing space. I could give other examples as well, but I think it's a really important arena to start.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay,
So,
Chip.
yeah, no question here, just a thank you. You know, people have heard me say before, the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of your life is to give it away. And you gave a lot away today, Mark. You gave so much away. You know, you know when a talk online is going well, when you actually see the number of participants actually growing. That happened here, and that at the end of a day, at the end of a program, that doesn't usually happen. So we just appreciate that we are partners with you. I'm on your board, and I love that. Your senior advisor, your senior person, Marcy's on our guest faculty. We are looking at ways to collaborate. I learn from you. You are my mutual mentor, and what I really appreciate is that you have given us the gift as a community, the MEA alum community, of so much. I mean, I think everybody is a bit bowled over by how many facts, quotes, social science white papers, you know. So I just feel that blessed. We started the day talking about gratitude and generosity, and I feel a lot of gratefulness, gratitude toward you. And I hope that our MEA alum community feels that as well as the generosity to just give back somehow to MEA based upon our full day together. I really appreciate you being the icing on the cake.
Well, Chip, the feeling's mutual, and I always know whenever I give a talk that the highlight is going to be when I talk about the modern elder idea. It's at that point that people wake up and start nodding, and so the gratitude runs both ways. And thanks so much for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Marc.